A week before the wedding, I dropped off a gift at my fiancée's mother's house. She screamed I harassed her. Police took me away. 3 days later, they took her for slander. Wedding canceled. My name is Rowan Hale, and if you'd asked me 6 months ago what my life would look like a week before my wedding, I'd have told you it would be filled with anticipation, last-minute tux fittings, and probably some pre-ceremony nerves. What I never would have imagined was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the taste of metal handcuffs biting into my wrists, all because of a lie so outrageous I thought no one in their right mind would believe it. It all started with something small, a gift basket. A week before the wedding, I decided to drop off a gesture of goodwill at my fiancée's mother's house. Maureen Lake and I never had a warm relationship, but I believed in trying, even when it felt hopeless. Quinn, my fiancée, was close with her mother. Their bond was suffocating at times, but I thought keeping peace was worth the effort. That morning, I had picked out a carefully arranged set of items. A bottle of white wine from her favorite vineyard, an assortment of local pastries, and a handwritten card thanking her for helping Quinn with the wedding. It was supposed to soften whatever sharpness she had toward me. I parked in front of her colonial-style house on a quiet suburban street. It was a little past 11. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of sprinklers, dogs barking, and a few kids on bikes. Nothing out of the ordinary. I carried the basket up the walkway, rang the doorbell, and waited. When no one answered, I set it on the porch table, tucked the card against the handle, and walked back to my car. That was it. No drama. No shouting. Not even a glimpse of Maureen. I thought nothing more of it. Until an hour later. I was at home, trimming down the guest list with Quinn when I heard the pounding on the door. It wasn't the polite kind of knock you get from a neighbor. It was the kind that makes your stomach flip because you know something's wrong. I opened the door and froze. 2 uniformed officers stood on the step, one with his hand resting near his belt. "Rowan Hale?" one of them asked. I nodded, confused. "You're under arrest for harassment," he said, and before I could even process the words, cold cuffs snapped around my wrists. The neighbors peeked out from their blinds as I was led down the steps like a criminal. My own fiancée stood in the hallway behind me, pale and speechless. I called out to her, asking what was happening, but she didn't respond. The officers pushed me into the cruiser, and the slam of the door echoed like a final judgment. At the station, everything moved fast. Paperwork, fingerprints, questions I couldn't believe I was being asked. They told me Maureen had filed a complaint, claiming I had come to her house uninvited, shouted obscenities, and tried to force my way inside. She said she feared for her safety. I laughed in disbelief at first, thinking this had to be some insane mistake. But the officers weren't laughing. They had her sworn statement, and in the eyes of the law, that was enough to justify hauling me in. I spent the afternoon in a holding cell that smelled like sweat and disinfectant. My phone buzzed endlessly in the evidence bag, but I couldn't reach it. The humiliation was suffocating. Every decision I had made to keep the peace with Maureen felt like a knife in my back. She had always looked at me with thinly veiled contempt, but this was nuclear. When they finally released me on bail, I walked out into the night air feeling like the world had shifted on its axis. My reputation was in shreds before the wedding even happened. And it wasn't just the arrest. Word spreads fast in a town where everyone knows everyone. By the next morning, I already had texts from colleagues asking if the rumors were true. Family members left confused voicemails, trying to understand why Quinn's mother would make such an accusation. My best man, Owen, called in a panic, asking if he should cancel the rehearsal dinner. What cut deepest was Quinn. She didn't come to the station. She didn't even call. When I got back to our apartment, she was sitting on the couch, her arms folded, her eyes darting everywhere but me. Her silence was worse than anger. It was a verdict without trial. When I tried to explain, she muttered something about how her mother must have felt threatened. "Maybe you shouldn't have gone over there unannounced," she said, as if that explained why I'd been dragged off in handcuffs. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a misunderstanding between families. This was an orchestrated attack. But the question gnawed at me. Why? What did Maureen gain from humiliating me like this, knowing it would blow up her own daughter's wedding? Unless she thought the destruction of my reputation would force me into compliance. The days that followed were a blur of shame and suspicion. My phone lit up with notifications I couldn't bear to read. Social media was already buzzing, people whispering that maybe I wasn't who I seemed. Old acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt entitled to speculate. The weight of judgment pressed down hard, and I started to feel like I was living someone else's nightmare. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts circled endlessly, replaying every second of dropping off that gift, wondering if there had been some camera hidden, some witness ready to twist the truth. Every move I'd made felt like evidence being built against me in some invisible court. It wasn't until Owen barged into my apartment 2 nights later, tossing a folder onto my kitchen table, that I felt the first shift in momentum. He had been digging, furious on my behalf. Inside were printouts of neighborhood security camera footage he'd tracked down. The neighbor across from Maureen's house had a Ring camera pointed at the street. The footage was clear, me walking up, leaving the basket, and leaving within a minute. No shouting, no banging on doors, no confrontation. Owen looked at me with fire in his eyes. "She lied," he said, "and I'm going to help you prove it." For the first time since the arrest, I felt a flicker of hope. But along with it came a darker realization. If Maureen was willing to lie so brazenly, what else was she capable of? And worse, why was Quinn staying silent while her mother's lies tore my life apart? The wedding was 7 days away, but everything I thought I knew about my future was already in ashes. And this was only the beginning. The morning after Owen showed me the security footage, I sat at my kitchen table staring at his laptop, replaying the clip over and over. There I was, walking up the path, setting the basket down, tucking the card in place, then leaving. That was it. No shouting, no aggression, nothing resembling harassment. A silent, undeniable record of the truth. The relief of having evidence was quickly replaced by anger. Maureen hadn't just exaggerated. She had fabricated an entire scene from thin air. She had sworn to police that I had threatened her, that I had shoved against her door, that she feared for her safety. Yet here was a crystal-clear recording showing otherwise. I wanted to storm over to Quinn and demand she watch it, demand she acknowledge what her mother had done. But part of me hesitated. I didn't know if she would believe it. After all, if she had believed me in the first place, I wouldn't have been sleeping alone on the couch while she avoided me like I carried a disease. Instead, I called a lawyer. I'd never needed one before, but this wasn't a fight I could handle on my own. That's how I met Sloane Carter. She was sharp, direct, and didn't waste time with sympathy. She looked at the footage, nodded once, and said, "She's finished." That was the first time I felt like maybe I could claw my way back from this nightmare. Sloane moved quickly. She filed motions, submitted the footage, and began preparing a countersuit for slander and malicious prosecution. "If someone lies under oath, we bury them with it," she told me flatly. 3 days later, I got the call I never expected. The same police department that had hauled me away in cuffs was now at Maureen's door. She was arrested for filing a false report, charged with slander and obstruction. The neighborhood that had watched me being dragged off my porch now saw her shoved into the back of a cruiser. On paper, it looked like justice. But in reality, it was messy. Quinn was livid. Not at her mother, at me. She showed up at my apartment, her face flushed, demanding to know why I would go this far, when we could have just handled this as a family. She said her mother was scared, overwhelmed by the stress of the wedding, that maybe she had misunderstood my intentions. I stared at her in disbelief. "Quinn, your mother swore I screamed at her and tried to break into her house. I was arrested because of her lies. Do you understand how serious that is?" But Quinn wouldn't bend. She kept circling back to the same point. If I truly cared about her, I would drop the charges and let it go for the sake of moving forward. That's when the first crack split our relationship wide open. For the first time, I realized Quinn wasn't neutral in this. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. The fallout was immediate. Word spread quickly through both families. My parents were furious on my behalf, openly calling Maureen toxic. Quinn's relatives rallied around her mother, spinning wild stories about how I must have provoked her, how the video didn't show the full picture. Every phone call turned into a shouting match. Aunts and uncles started declining their invitations. Vendors grew nervous about being attached to a wedding linked to a public scandal. By the end of the week, the florist and the photographer both canceled. It felt like the wedding was collapsing piece by piece, and Quinn's solution was to tell me to fix it. But I wasn't interested in salvaging a wedding that had become nothing more than a stage for Maureen's manipulations. I was interested in finding out why. Why would a mother torpedo her daughter's marriage in such a dramatic, public way? What could she possibly gain? That's where Sloane came in again. She had contacts, investigators who knew how to dig where it hurt. And what they uncovered shifted everything. It turned out Maureen wasn't just an overbearing mother. She was in deep financial trouble. She had racked up debt on multiple credit cards, drained a retirement fund, and was one step away from losing her house. On top of that, she had recently lost a lawsuit against a business partner that left her owing a significant settlement. She was drowning, and drowning people don't think rationally. They grasp for anything that will keep them afloat. But here's the kicker. If Quinn married me, Maureen believed she could latch onto my financial stability. My inheritance from my father, the trust fund I rarely even touched, had always made me a target of her passive-aggressive remarks. She saw me as a walking wallet with her daughter as the bridge. And when she realized I wasn't pliable, when she realized I wouldn't bend to her demands during the wedding planning, She chose another tactic. Destroy me publicly, then corner me into submission. If the harassment charge had stuck, I would have been desperate to avoid more scandal. I might have agreed to settle things privately, to smooth it over, to let her dictate terms in exchange for keeping the peace. That was her plan. Instead, the plan backfired. And now she was the one facing charges. The irony would have been almost funny if it hadn't wrecked my relationship in the process. Because Quinn didn't see her mother as manipulative or desperate. She saw her as vulnerable, as a victim who needed protecting. Even when confronted with the financial records, even when shown the lawsuit documents, Quinn shook her head. You don't understand, she whispered. She did everything for me growing up. She sacrificed everything. She's scared, Rowan. She's just scared. But I understood perfectly. I understood that the woman I was about to marry couldn't see the truth staring her in the face. Or maybe she refused to. The week rolled on like a car accident in slow motion. The rehearsal dinner, meant to be a joyful gathering, turned into a half-empty room filled with tension so thick you could slice it. Relatives avoided eye contact, whispered behind napkins, and excused themselves early. Every toast fell flat. And through it all, Quinn clung to her mother's side, as if proximity to Maureen's disaster somehow made her stronger. She started making veiled comments to me, suggesting that maybe postponing the wedding would give everyone time to heal. But it wasn't about healing. It was about control. By the end of that disastrous dinner, I knew there was no fixing this. Not with Quinn in denial. Not with Maureen still trying to spin herself as the victim. And certainly not with my own dignity hanging by a thread. The wedding wasn't postponed. It was already dead. The only question left was how much further Maureen, and by extension, Quinn, would fall when the truth came crashing down. By the time the calendar rolled down to 3 days before the ceremony, everything that had once felt certain now felt like quicksand. The tuxedo hung unworn in my closet, the honeymoon ticket sat in an email folder I couldn't bring myself to open, and the woman I was supposed to marry seemed less like a partner and more like an adversary defending her family's fortress. Quinn had moved back into her mother's house after the arrest, claiming she needed space to think. Every attempt I made to talk to her ended in the same suffocating loop. She acknowledged her mother had made a mistake, but insisted that pressing charges was too extreme. When I reminded her that I had been handcuffed in broad daylight because of those lies, she brushed it off like I was inflating the damage. It wasn't damage. It was destruction, and the cracks were widening by the hour. The first sign came from the venue. The manager called me directly, her voice tense but polite. Given the recent public issues, she explained, we don't feel comfortable hosting the event anymore. Reputation is important to us, and unfortunately, this situation has caused some concern with other clients. Translation, my name was poison. The cancellation fee was astronomical. Money wasn't the problem, it was the humiliation. They were effectively telling me that I wasn't welcome in their pristine halls, that my wedding carried a stench they wanted no part of. Then came the caterer. Then the decorator. One by one, contracts unraveled. Even the officiant, a family friend of Quinn's, withdrew. It doesn't feel right under these circumstances, he said. It was like watching dominoes tumble in slow motion, each one dragging me closer to a conclusion I no longer resisted. This marriage wasn't going to happen. Still, Quinn clung to the fantasy. She insisted we could salvage it. If you would just talk to my mother, drop this legal nonsense, people would come around. She pleaded over the phone one night. That was the moment the last thread snapped. You're asking me to trade my dignity for a seat at your mother's table. I told her. That's not a marriage. That's a hostage situation. Her silence confirmed what I already knew. She would never choose me over Maureen. Meanwhile, Sloane encouraged me to stop reacting and start taking control. They built this storm around you, she said, but storms don't last. We make sure the record does. She filed public court documents detailing Maureen's false report, attaching the footage as an exhibit. Anyone who wanted to gossip now had access to the full truth, if they could stomach reading it. But gossip doesn't care about truth. Gossip cares about drama. The rehearsal dinner proved it. What should have been a night of laughter, a chance to shake off the stress before the big day, turned into a social autopsy. Only half the invited guests showed up, and those who did spent the evening whispering at their tables, their eyes darting toward me like I was some exhibit in a zoo. Plates of food went untouched. The clinking of glasses was replaced with the low hum of speculation. Quinn tried to keep up appearances. She clutched her champagne flute, stood to give a toast, and forced a smile. To love, she began, her voice trembling, and to the strength it takes to move through difficult times together. The irony stung. Her words landed with the heaviness of a eulogy. I watched her eyes flick toward her mother at the other end of the table, as if waiting for approval. Maureen sat stone-faced, wearing the expression of someone who believed she was still in control of the room despite being days away from a court date. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and without a word, walked out. Chairs scraped behind me, whispers rose, but I didn't turn back. Leaving her there mid-toast was cruel, maybe, but it was honest. I wasn't going to play the groom in a farce written by her mother. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured a drink and stared out the window at the city lights. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to clarity. The wedding was finished, whether Quinn admitted it or not. The only question was whether I would let them bury me in the ashes, or whether I would walk away with fire still burning in my hands. The next morning, I found my answer. When I checked my email, there was a flood of messages. Reporters, bloggers, even local news outlets. Somehow, the court filings had gone public, and people were digging. They wanted statements. They wanted reactions. They wanted me to play the part of either the villain or the victim. Instead, I gave them facts. I forwarded Sloane's filings. I shared the footage. I didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. I simply put the truth in their hands and let Maureen's lies speak for themselves. By noon, the narrative began to shift. Comment threads filled with outrage, not at me, but at the audacity of a woman weaponizing false accusations to control her daughter's fiancé. People dissected the footage frame by frame, mocking the absurdity of her claims. Even those who had whispered about me days earlier now whispered about her. The tide was turning, but the turning tide did not save the wedding. 2 days before the ceremony, Quinn sent me a long message. It wasn't an apology. It was an ultimatum. She said she loved me but couldn't abandon her mother, not when the world was attacking her. If I wanted the marriage, I had to agree to drop the case, issue a joint statement saying it was all a misunderstanding, and move forward together. I stared at the words, my chest tightening with disbelief. She wasn't offering reconciliation. She was offering submission. And I refused. When I didn't respond, she followed up with silence. No calls. No texts. Just a growing distance that said more than words could. The day before the wedding, the venue stood empty. The chairs were stacked, the flowers never delivered, the altar dismantled before it was ever built. Guests canceled hotel reservations. Flights were refunded. And I sat in my apartment, watching it all implode, not with sadness, but with grim satisfaction. Because sometimes destruction is the only path to freedom. But I wasn't finished. If Maureen thought slander was a weapon, she was about to learn what consequences felt like. And if Quinn thought choosing her mother over me would protect her, she was about to learn that standing on the wrong side of truth has a price of its own. The morning of the canceled wedding arrived in silence. No tux, no vows, no guests gathering in the venue we had once toured with excitement. Instead, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. Friends checking in, journalists sniffing for quotes, vendors demanding final payments. But what struck me most were the absences. Quinn didn't call. Neither did Maureen. Their silence was loud, heavy, and telling. They had retreated into each other's orbit, cut off from the implosion they'd created. That was fine, because I had no intention of retreating. The case against Maureen moved forward like a hammer through glass. Sloane made sure of it. She presented the footage, the false report, and the contradictions in Maureen's statements with surgical precision. In court, Maureen tried to soften her lies, claiming she had misinterpreted my presence, that she felt threatened, even if nothing happened. But the video didn't lie. Neither did the neighbors who testified that they saw me leave quietly. The judge didn't hold back. Maureen was charged with filing a false report, obstruction, and defamation. The fines alone were crushing. But worse was the humiliation. The story was public, and it spread beyond the town. Her name became synonymous with slander. Businesses she had worked with cut ties. Friends stopped answering her calls. The social circle she had once ruled with sharp comments and a glass of wine crumbled overnight. And Quinn, she doubled down. Instead of distancing herself, she clung tighter to her mother, showing up at hearings, glaring at me from across the courtroom. She refused to testify on my behalf, refused to admit that her mother's lies had nearly destroyed me. In her mind, loyalty to blood outweighed loyalty to truth. But loyalty doesn't pay bills. The canceled wedding left a mountain of debts, fees, penalties, unpaid vendors. And since the contracts had been signed under Quinn's and Maureen's names, they were the ones who bore the brunt. I had been careful, meticulous, about keeping my finances separate. That inheritance Maureen had been salivating over? Untouched, unreachable. Instead, she and her daughter were left scrambling to cover tens of thousands in costs with no help from me. I invested the refunded honeymoon money into something else. A startup idea Owen and I had been sketching on napkins for years. What started as a distraction from the wreckage quickly took off. Within months, we had investors, momentum, and a product that people wanted. My name, once dragged through the mud, began reappearing in articles again, not as a man accused, but as a man building something new. Every success was a knife twisting in the narrative Maureen had tried to craft. She had wanted me desperate, ruined, begging for reconciliation. Instead, I was rising, and she was sinking. The final blow came from within her own family. Quinn's uncle, a quiet man who had always kept his distance during wedding planning, stepped forward after the scandal. He admitted to my parents that Maureen had been pressuring him for loans, dangling Quinn's marriage as leverage. She wanted to secure herself, he explained. She saw Rowan as a bank account, nothing more. When word of that spread, even Quinn's cousins, once firmly on her side, stopped defending her. Invitations to family gatherings dried up. Maureen and Quinn became pariahs in their own circle, the subjects of whispered conversations they could never escape. And me? I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. Their downfall was loud enough without my voice in it. Months passed. Life regained its rhythm. The anger that had once kept me awake at night dulled into something quieter, sharper, resolve. I learned to separate noise from truth, loyalty from manipulation. And in that space, I built something stronger than any wedding could have given me, freedom. But there was one last encounter I'll never forget. It was late autumn, nearly half a year after the wedding that never was. I was leaving a cafe when I saw her. Quinn, standing on the sidewalk, her once polished appearance dulled by fatigue. She looked smaller somehow, worn down. She spotted me, froze, then forced a weak smile. "We should talk," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't stop walking. There was nothing left to say. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.